This is episode 453 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, last night was the election returns, election night, and to say that it did not quite go as planned for the national or the New Mexico GOP would be a bit of an understatement. And
the red tsunami was maybe a red wave and then maybe a red ripple, possibly.
It was like a guy with some kind of disorder peeing on a plant that unfortunately he's got a health problem because it was red, and that's about what we're talking about last night. But that's kind of the way a lot of folks are feeling nowadays here. And before we get started, you and I made some predictions.
Yeah, I was in the words of Get Smart, missed it by that much. So
yeah, I mean
maybe a mile.
The only one I got you on was the one I least wanted to get you on, which was Michelle Lujan Grisham running for re-election, and I had her winning narrowly. Wound up not being so narrowly. In fact, aside from the Democrats in New Mexico, and we'll broadly talk about what happened, but aside from the Democratic Party in general, the biggest winners in New Mexico last night were Brian Sanderoff, because he really
nailed it. He nailed it. He had it nailed. And so we were talking, and he was Sanderoff wasn't the only one that was on the line. There's whole up until really the time that the election returns started coming, they were like, "Oh, are these pollsters dead meat? Have they, are they irrelevant now?" And we saw in New Mexico and in a lot of places around the country, polling is not dead. It had some fairly good predictive capabilities.
Well, there were a lot of polls that were very wrong. Right here in New Mexico. But Sanderoff, being the New Mexico guy that he is, all along, he had Michelle Lujan Grisham winning. The latest poll he had was 8 points. It wound up being 6, which is, I was talking to, believe it or not, yes, folks, I have Democrat friends, or at least people on the Democratic side of the aisle that I talk to on a semi-regular basis. And even those folks were saying before the election that they thought it was going to be a much closer race than what Sanderoff had. Now, 8 versus 6, I think that's much closer than calling it a 2-point race. I mean, 2 points is a genuinely close election. 8 and 6, not so much. And then Yvette Harrell, she held tough throughout the night. You and I both predicted that she would win, get over the top. It's a narrow lead right now, but I think it's safe to say that Gabe Vasquez is going to be the next congressperson from District 2. So Brian Egolf can pat himself on the back. He got the redistricting done. He cut it pretty close to the edge there in District 2, but he got the result that he wanted, which was a trifecta among those congressional seats here in New Mexico. So other than that, it was a blue wave, blue tsunami. Pick another term. Nothing that I voted for won. Nothing that I voted against lost. All the Republican or conservative or say no to debt or more spending, all that stuff failed completely and without much sweat being broken on any of those issues.
Yeah, and then Paul, New Mexico right this second, it is a Democrat controlled state, lock, stock, and barrel. I think I know who the most senior elected official who's a Republican is in the state of New Mexico. I believe it's Mayor Greg Hull of Rio Rancho. If you were to, just say somebody who's a Republican who, and to take nothing away from the mayor, but, the key is the entire, all of the congressional delegation, both senators, the governor, most of the judges at the Supreme and Appeals Court. It is a Democrat state, lock, stock, and barrel right this second. And, just one other point to follow up on the Yvette Harrell Vasquez race. Yeah, they did cut it mighty, mighty close. They tried to redistrict her out in a way that wouldn't hurt the other two districts. And, I think that's the other theme I saw kind of nationwide is the letter next to your name tended to be more important than the candidate in many, many races. And by my assessment, in terms of electability, broad electability, Gabe Vasquez had a lot going against him, and he was still able to get over the hump. There were, I could list a dozen Democrats, across the state that would have a profile that would be even more electable in that district than he did, but he got it done. And we saw, in a lot of places beyond New Mexico, sometimes it was just, it's like cheering for the jerseys in a pro sports team. All the players get traded away, you get all new ones, and you still cheer for it. The D's did really well compared to what people thought it might happen.
And I guess the only thing I can pat myself on the back and say I got right, we didn't talk about this last week, but earlier on, I had referenced Karen Bedoni, speaking of jerseys. She wore the yellow jersey, which is the Libertarian Party jersey. A lot of polls had her at 5%. She wound up much closer to 2%, not in the statistical margin of impacting the Ronchetti race overall. And not really a surprise to me, but that's thin gruel indeed in terms of this particular race and the races around the state of New Mexico. So yeah, it's a total blue domination. I need to come up with another shade of blue for some of the charts that I have in terms of looking back all the way to 1930. And I agree with you 100% that while so. I'm going to use this to transition to the national races. When you look at New Mexico and you realize that nationally speaking, the red wave turned into much less of an impressive trickle. I knew then, although we were already seeing the results of New Mexico, and my concern at the outset was New Mexico lays an egg, and the national is a red wave. As it turns out, New Mexico was just because we were following it more closely and the way the results were coming in, with all the Democrats leading at the outset, it was just a harbinger of things to come. That early optimism about a red wave nationwide. I think Ron DeSantis threw everybody. Florida collects their votes so quickly and tallies them and reports them, and Ron DeSantis had just an amazing election, considering the guy won by a few thousand votes 4 years ago as a relative unknown, and now he's one of the most prominent, certainly Republican politicians in the entire country, and just had an amazing election, as did most of Florida. But those results fooled a lot of people. I'd mentioned New Hampshire's Senate race as a potential harbinger because that was an East Coast race. It wound up being one, not in the way that I had expected. Baldock really never put any pressure on Maggie Hassan, and just in general. So where we are now, and last point, in Pennsylvania, the Democrat won the governor's race fairly handily, but the Democrat Fetterman in the Senate, who deeply flawed, very, very far to the left, really an odd character even before he had the stroke and has trouble functioning and speaking, still managed to win. So yes, there was a drop off, right, but he still is elected by the Democrats, who I agree with you, especially on the Democratic side. It didn't matter if you were a ball of yarn, you had a D on your name and at the ballot, and you got it. Now on the Republican side, Georgia's the one. Brian Kemp won handily as governor in Georgia, whereas the flawed Republican candidate is probably heading to a runoff because of the dynamics in Georgia, Herschel Walker versus Raphael Warnock. So both parties certainly have their just party loyalists. And it seems like that is the defining characteristic of the American political scene right now, is that it doesn't matter to a large extent, although having Donald Trump's imprimatur does not help. At least it did not help at all in the general election this time around. Trump had a really bad night. Candidates that he endorsed either severely lagged, Ohio, J.D. Vance versus the governor DeWine, or Dr. Oz losing, or Herschel Walker on the way to, at best, a runoff. We'll see about Kari Lake. Arizona is a bleep show in terms of their results. So it's...
they still have a 66% of the vote counted at this point.
I hear by Friday that is one of them. And that's going to have a lot of impact on that, and Nevada are the two remaining Senate races that are going to kind of impact Georgia to an extent. It looks like Georgia's definitely heading to a runoff. And, there's another question as to what's going to happen out of Georgia and how that's going to impact the U.S. Senate. But it does look like the Republicans are going to have a slim margin in the U.S. House. But, it's a very, very poor showing. I think pollsters across the country, with the exception of Sanderoff, maybe and a few others, definitely did not get it again.
Yes, and it is interesting, depending on who the pollster is, and, it's one of those things that is good that we can have this discussion. In New Mexico's most noteworthy pollster has a reputation as being fair, if not, not necessarily always right. But Paul, I know this is going to come as a surprise to you, wink, wink. There's a thing called push polling, where you just throw polls out there, you construct them in such a way that they give you the result, and you try to demoralize the other side. And, I think there may be a bit of that has happened on both sides recently. And so that's why, when you look broadly, it's good to look, at least nationally anyway, across a whole bunch of polls, not one and not at one time. But the poll that counts, elections are behind us, at least for the most part, not necessarily in Arizona, and certainly more to come in Georgia.
Yeah, you can't blame pollsters in a lot of states for maybe putting a finger on the scale for Republicans after a few years of kind of missing the shy Trump voter, et cetera. And this time around, they just overdid it in a lot of races. And so that is kind of the way things went. I think we pretty much covered it. Colorado was a state with a Senate race. Colorado is a very different state in so many ways from New Mexico. Colorado also had a governor's race. But when you saw the race coming in, the results coming in Colorado, you just had a feeling that that New Mexico was going to track Colorado. And politically, we can track Colorado even if we don't economically or in any other way. I mean, when you have a presidential race, you have that electoral college map. In years past, typically it's been Colorado and New Mexico as the blue states of the Southwest. Arizona did recently flip, and that's an interesting dynamic to watch, and that's still relevant in this election. But it's it's interesting to watch the evolution of the American Southwest, and I guess Texas, on the other hand, you've still got that red firewall, so to speak. Florida's now a robustly red state based on current political leaders and trends. And, for all the money they put into Texas, the Democrats didn't make any inroads over there. So national picture be damned, there's still some states where if you like low taxes and want to live among a bunch of Republican-oriented people, Florida and Texas are two of your prime states, and I suspect they're going to continue to enact policies and attract people from all across the country and the globe.
Yes, and then on those when you look at Texas in particular, and Georgia, you have some candidates now. Beto O'Rourke is probably done as a Texas politician. I'm not sure anyone wants him to run it. And then if you look at Stacey Abrams in Georgia, she's now lost quite a bit. And, maybe Stacey and Beto should move to a state and run against each other so one of them could get a win. But the point I want to make around that is we have kind of there are certain political figures that are nationalized before they even make real big progress in their home states. And I think Beto O'Rourke is one of those that's big time. And then the reason I bring that up is when you look at the difference between Colorado, which is very much a Democrat-controlled state, and New Mexico, that's very much a Democrat-controlled state. Colorado has to and has gone its own way policy-wise on things way more than New Mexico.
True.
Because, one, they don't have all of the oil and gas. They have a little bit. They have a much more of a free market economy. Mm-hmm. And reasons that there's probably more reasons, I'm sure, than that I don't understand. But New Mexico, when it comes to our elected officials, whether it be the governor, our senators, now all of our representatives, they remind me they might as well be national Democrats. They generically have the national Democrat as almost the alpha and omega, the beginning and end of their campaign, and not really a whole lot about New Mexico and what it means to New Mexicans. So that is something that, in the next few years, things are a little shaky to say the least, from energy policy, education, crime, a lot of things. And then, will the Democrats in New Mexico feel some pressure and feel like they need to do some things to address that, or are we just going to go along saying, "Hey, we are pure from a national Democrat point of view, and we're just going to go about our business until somebody comes in and beats us"?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of aphorisms in politics, and one that I think has officially been disproven is Tip O'Neill. Back in the 80s, kind of Ronald Reagan's foil there, the Democrat, Massachusetts, Speaker of the House, said all politics is local.
And I think there was a time, at the time he said it was probably correct.
Yeah, but it hasn't really been correct for quite a while. Right. I don't know exactly what changed it. It's not like there weren't TV networks and the like back then. For whatever reason now, though, both political parties tend to be driven by top-down voices, and certainly New Mexico Democrats have fallen in line with that. We don't know enough about Republicans in New Mexico because, quite frankly, there are so few of them. I think we're going to see pictures popping up in post offices.
Yeah, and on milk cartons in the store.
Yeah, has anyone seen a Republican in New Mexico? Certainly not an elected Republican. It's few and far between. And I want to bring one thing back, and it'll take us into the next part of the show, is the legislature, only the House was up without going into all the races with the redistricting and whatnot. There were a few that switched, but by and large, it is a status quo legislature with a heavy Democrat lead, margin for error, etc. Big Democrat numbers in the House of Representatives here in New Mexico, which is the body that we quite frankly care most about, and constantly harp on the fact that really Republicans have never had a governing majority in the state of New Mexico since 1930 by governing majority House, Senate, and the governor's mansion. So it was pretty shocking that it wasn't shocking based on Ronchetti losing, but it was surprising that folks want to keep doing the same thing in New Mexico. There's no impetus for changing direction on a lot of policies. And one of the policies that I would love to have seen play a bigger role in New Mexico's race, and I do think Ronchetti ran a good race. I think he was a good, solid candidate. It's going to be very difficult for Republicans to find good, solid candidates to run these statewide races in the future. Like if you're Jeremy Gay and you just got beat by 14 points, worked your butt off, had limited name ID going into things, but really did a good job and is a great candidate. you got to think twice about whether you want to put your family through all that to run again. And I think that's going to be a constant concern for Republicans. The bench is thin enough already, but these education scores, and I know we've harped on them, but we harp on them for a reason. And the latest harping, if you will, and the status quo mentality comes from comparing our fourth grade reading scores against what happened in Mississippi. Now, Wally, we had a podcast on a while ago. Let's see, I've got the number right here. It was Jameson Taylor, episode 314. So, 140 or so episodes ago now. But we discussed what Mississippi has done to change their education outcomes. And so with these most recent NAEP scores, National Assessment of Educational Progress, New Mexico has done the status quo. We had the opportunity under Susana Martinez to enact the Florida model, the Jeb Bush model, the model that Mississippi wound up enacting. And so back in 2011, on fourth grade reading on this national test, Mississippi and New Mexico were basically tied with a 1-point advantage going to Mississippi at the time, 209 to 208. As of the most recent scores, Mississippi has jumped up, even with falling down a little bit during the COVID pandemic. They're at 216, so a 7-point rise. New Mexico, we went from 208 in 2011 to 202 in 2022. So our status quo is not just status quo, it's actually failing our kids. And Mississippi, on the other hand, did some basic reforms a la Susana Martinez, got them through the legislature, and has seen results. And I realize that these results didn't come out until mid-October, but boy, I do think that is an area of the campaign that was not adequately addressed. And you got to have both, and Ronchetti had a plan. He had a plan, but I don't think that was, it was a lot more about crime and kind of the back and forth there than it was about those substantive policies. So I'm nitpicking a bit, but I really wish education policy was a bigger player in this campaign.
Yeah. And then, Paul, I was thinking about that. And, when you run a campaign, what do you emphasize? And, one of the things, just to throw a number out there is that when you attack education, as a Republican, a lot of the Ds will say, "Oh, you're attacking our teachers," and there are a lot of teachers out there, and so to the extent that can easily be used against you, and this is one of those issues that is, unlike homelessness, which you definitely see that in Albuquerque and across many other cities across New Mexico. Crime is something that you don't have to go too far to have somebody who's a victim of property or violent crime. These education stats just kind of, simmer below the surface, and there's nothing that's hugely apparent about that. But yes, we talk about that a lot. That's been a big issue. And you know what? There's a lot of groups who do things, quote unquote, for the children. And it's one of those, if you really want to do something for the children, you'll work on education in New Mexico to get us off of the literally dead last spot that we have right now.
Yeah. And that, that's the fundamental issue. Yes, New Mexico, when you see the results nationally, it's not a surprise that we continue down the path that we have been on. But on the other hand, after the COVID lockdowns of the governor, which failed to do anything to address the virus in any substantive way, that put our kids out of school and behind the 8 ball in ways that were not seen necessarily in other states. The economic, the other failures, the kind of, for all of his flaws, Bill Richardson was a personable guy that people liked, even if they might think he's a corrupt bastard. But Michelle Lujan Grisham, I don't see anybody thinking of her as a very likable person. Certainly during the COVID, when she's waving pens at people and talking crap about Espanola residents for not wearing masks out on the street. So I don't know. Trying to understand the what drives voters. Was it abortion? Was it just some, other personal issues, the fact that your grandfather was a Democrat or something like that. It really, it's hard to tell, but I want to circle back, Jin Saki style, to this education issue. And we're going to talk to Fred Nathan a week from now for an interview on the podcast. And Fred runs Think New Mexico. Fred and I spent a lot of yesterday evening together on KSFR doing election results live on the radio up there. And it's always good to see Fred. He's a good guy and somebody who really tries to push a lot of reasonable policies. Not always are we in agreement, but he has an education report that is worth a look. And it's worth checking out. We agree with most of what he says. The one thing that he cites Mississippi as well early on in the report, and I'm like, Fred,
what policies?
Why don't we just do what Mississippi did? And I'll be asking him about that. But unlike Voices for Children, which I don't see as a good actor, even though they continue to get their progressive candidate, not that they're necessarily the ones running the campaigns, but their people continue to get elected, partisan left-wing activists. Fred tries to play a more moderate, middle-of-the-road game, whereas really narrowly targeting policies that he thinks can make a difference. And so I respect his approach, whether we always agree or not. And so he'll be on the show next week to discuss that. And that's I have a feeling it'll be a fascinating conversation. But yeah, Mississippi has drawn a lot of attention, not just from us crazy right wingers, but others.
Yeah, and it's one of these things, Paul. Think New Mexico, they tend to focus on things that are not going well, and that if we're changed and we're going better, could be more successful. And when it comes to education, being where we are, it's huge. If we were, Paul, if we were 25th, maybe even to 37th, at the average, even to in the upper three quarters, I don't think that we'd be having as much conversation about this. But last is not a good place to be when it comes to that. And again, these aren't like a fantasy football league, where we're going to win a pot of $500 at the end of the season. This has to do with the children in our state, the school children who are going to have to go on and get jobs and careers. And when we know that, having an education and having the ability to have certain skills in reading and math, etc., correlate very highly to successful careers in life. This is a hugely important issue, but it never happens in a second. This is one of those, this is a long-term, this is like a glacier or a tsunami. Maybe there's a lot more going on, and I'll use a tsunami metaphor. There's a lot more beneath the surface in terms of damage that you don't necessarily notice when you just see the top of the wave.
Yeah, and we passed all the constitutional amendments. Rio Grande Foundation recommended against all of the constitutional amendments. We knew the early childhood was not a battle that was going to be won. Not surprising, but unfortunate that the Amendment 2, which is now going to be used to fund private, enterprises, private individuals with your tax dollars, that one won as well. And the one for the judges on this number 3 also won. But getting back to those NAEP scores, and I realize we're hammering this, but when you get in the 52nd place in a 50-state nation, I think you really do need to reevaluate yourselves. And we've talked about early childhood, and the people decided, well, we're going to spend a lot more money on that in the years to come. Well, that decision was made and started really back in 2012, that we were going to start allocating more and more money to early childhood programs. And I posted a chart at Heirs of Enchantment that shows that we started out with, $135 or so million, $130 million back in 2012. And then ramped that up through 2020. And now it's going to see even more ramping up in 21, 22, and moving forward now with that constitutional amendment approved. And, the question that I think needs to be asked is, with the NAEP results that we just saw, on what basis do we see the early childhood funding improving educational outcomes for our children in the here and now? Are they not tracking the kids that went through these programs back in 2012 and all the way through 2020? Those are kids that are old enough to be taking the 4th grade test for reading. And it just strikes me as incredibly... people in this state tend to vote for more spending, more money for whatever it is based on very little evidence. And it's not just the R or the D thing. It's the skepticism about what government does and how government works in the state of New Mexico, or the lack thereof, really, that I think is particularly baffling and confusing. But there you go. A lot of stuff about education and NAEP scores, and one of the issues that I really would like to have seen be more thoroughly vetted during this election season.
Yeah, and then Paul, it's not. This is certainly not the only area, but there's it's almost like some things that are common sense. I will just say that common sense is usually a pretty high indicator of whether something works or not. But there are a few things where you can point to, and I do think maybe early childhood is pretty much, it seems like it should work. Mm-hmm. It seems like this would be what we should be doing, and it would really help things to get better. But then when you look at the data compared to not doing anything or doing something else, it doesn't work out as well. And believe me, Paul, it's one of those, I would love it if it would work, if we're going to do this. But we'll see if it makes any impact. And again, it doesn't take forever, because the pre-K and K kids here and for about 6 years will be 4th graders, and we'll see if there's any difference relative to other states and relative to surrounding states and peers across the country.
Yeah, it's we're going to know in the not too distant future whether all this new money for pre-K and early childhood and et cetera, really has an impact. And my strong belief is no, but now we will know. And I think the real question is, if in 5 years or 6 years we're back here having the same conversation in podcast episode 0,300 or something, and it's not had an impact, will the voters of New Mexico do anything about it? Because that, it's not like this is the first and only government program to have ever just fallen upon the rocks of reality. We've said this about the rail runner, the spaceport, and we've been right on it from day one. And it does seem like a majority of the voters, at least, they don't have very long memories when it comes to these government programs.
Yeah, and it is interesting. In 6 years, at the current pace, we'll be closing in on podcast 1,000. So.
I'm just ballparking it.
No, I'm just saying that's a scary thing to think about. And I'll just close, with regard to a couple of the policies, and this one is the old Mark Twain quote: "It's not what you don't know that kills you; it's what you know for sure that ain't true." And this may be this is what the research shows with the pre-K, but we're going to be spending a lot of money to see whether it's true or not.
Yeah, and we're going to kind of use this to get to the this next talking point, this item, to get to the city level. And speaking of failed government programs, this is probably the first time in this podcast, in this, in our blog, in any public format that we've talked about a study from Greenpeace, which, Greenpeace, pretty hardcore left-wing environmental group. They did a report finding that just 5% of the plastic waste in the United States is recycled. There's been other reports talking about, some of this was sent over. A lot of it was sent over to China, and that China and other Asian countries would just dump it in the oceans. And so when you talk about those issues with the plastic in the oceans, it's really not about plastic bags here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or any other city. It's about those kinds of things. And this isn't a shock, this report, but we have this recycling program in the city of Albuquerque where we send out big, heavy trucks, polluting trucks, paid full-time workers. And according to the solid waste department here in Albuquerque, the recycling program's cost rose 900% in 2 years recently when they were dealing with this massive shift in recycling where China finally said, we're not going to take your stuff. And, this is something that should be so nonpartisan, it's simple, but it really does. It highlights the importance of market forces. I know those are ignored. A lot of people, politicians and others, tend to think that whatever they believe should just be done and that market forces be damned. But, it's not worth it to do all of this for the limited amount of plastic recycling. It seems like if we focused on things that are actually recyclable and worth money, i.e. aluminum cans, which are 44 cents a pound right now, that we would have a less costly recycling program. And it would be, I know this is shocking because Rio Grande Foundation hates the environment, that I personally just run my car to get more pollution out there, according to many on the left. But in reality, we care about the environment at the Rio Grande Foundation, but we want to harness market forces wherever possible, and including, maybe an educational program at the city rather than focusing on plastics to try to enhance recycling of those aluminum cans and doing stuff like that makes sense.
Yeah, and then the one I like when I worked in Santa Fe many years ago, they had you put your glass bottles out in these separate containers, and they'd come by and pick up trucks and pick those up. And guess where they took them, Paul?
The dump.
The dump. And so they got a special, highly inefficient ride. Recycling. There are models out there for certain products that work absolutely wonderfully. The one that is my personal favorite is lead. 99% of the lead is recycled. Most of it goes through car batteries and similar things. And so when you buy a new battery, even if you buy it at Walmart, and you
Walmart.
and I'm just saying, you don't go to a place, you don't go to a shop. Sure. And Walmart will say, okay, now we're charging you for the recycling fee, and you'll get that back if you bring in your old battery. And so as a result, there's an economic and a systemic, and it makes a lot of sense to do that. And so you don't need to mine very much lead because so much of it is recycled. But when it comes to something like glass, and glass is really sand, there's a sand that's melted. There's a lot of sand out there. And so the energy that's required, and much less the labor costs and other things to quote unquote do this green recycling of other products, it's not making a whole lot of sense. So,
yeah. And, I'll just note that if you play golf at any of the City of Albuquerque golf courses, at least Ladera, I don't know all of them, but Ladera, they have big fancy solar panels out front, which I don't mind because on a hot day when you're playing golf, they block the sun, makes your car a lot more pleasant. Yeah. But whether it's a sensible use of city tax dollars is another open question. But you go have a beer or two on the golf course. I rarely drink on the golf course, and those cans go right in the trash because they don't even make an attempt to recycle them at the City of Albuquerque. So, those are low cost, easy, thoughtful ways that our political leaders could change the way things are done in more cost-effective and environmentally effective ways. But alas, it doesn't seem like many of our leaders and quite frankly the voters care about the results. They care about voting for the person that they see as having the label that makes more sense. And I don't know. It is, we're going to be looking at next November some city council races here in Albuquerque. We're going to be moving forward with, I believe, more school board races here in Albuquerque. Obviously, the first thing on the agenda is going to be a 60-day session, which is just going to be a real challenge, let's face it, with a new Speaker of the House. So that's first off on the agenda, but that is just going to be a suck it up and take it the best you can. And next summer we'll be dealing with potential electricity outages here in New Mexico, and I'm very interested to see what, if anything, Governor Lujan Grisham will do to make sure that we have enough power to keep our lights on next summer, and what kind of hot button issue that becomes, assuming that PNM is correct in saying that we have a lot of challenges there. So we're looking ahead at the Rio Grande Foundation, licking our wounds a little bit today, and we'll see how things go. But boy, buck up. This too shall pass, and we'll do our best and try to continue to put out good information, good public policy to try to move New Mexico in a more reasonable direction.
Yes, and Paul, the common thread of a lot of these issues is that they take a while to develop, and that whether the policy is good, bad, or indifferent, a lot of times you don't know for years. And when you're talking about things like education, energy, I'm sure there's people out there in the world that would disagree with the approach you take, but it tends to be based on the research and what happens in other places, and dare I say, Paul, do you think it could be based on the science and the data? But we know that that's been ruined as a phrase during the COVID era. So we almost need a different messaging, as like what really works. And there are some policies in New Mexico that may not really work, but a lot of times you won't know that for many years to come.
Yeah. Well, we'll sign off there. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.